Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 16 in a series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. It's my hope and belief that each of these episodes will stand on its own. But if you're the sort of person that likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to at your convenience in the same place you found this one. Last week, I covered the short-lived Hungarian Revolution of 1956, where the Soviet Union crushed a pro-democracy uprising in Hungary, ensured that Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe would remain subservient to the Soviet Union, and significantly escalated the Cold War. This week, I'm covering a topic that's a little less depressing: the achievements of the Soviet space program in the early years of the space race. This is The End of History, Part 16. Moscow can sometimes be a pretty overwhelming place. It is the largest city in Europe, with a population of about 13 million within the city limits and over 20 million in the metropolitan area. It is filled with great historic landmarks. Its most famous, the Kremlin, Red Square, and St. Basil's Cathedral with its famous onion domes, mark the center of the city. As you move away from the city's center, however, into the residential neighborhoods where most ordinary Muscovites live, as with many major cities, the architecture becomes less impressive. Some of you may remember back in episode 12, I talked about the post-war housing shortage in the USSR, and I mentioned that it was a problem that would continue to plague the Soviet Union right up to its demise. Over the years, the leadership of the USSR under Khrushchev and later Brezhnev made multiple attempts to solve the problem of housing by constructing massive apartment buildings in cities across the country. However, to build housing on a scale that was needed and to do so quickly, one thing Soviet planners sacrificed was diversity of design. They essentially designed one basic, prefabricated apartment building and constructed thousands of them in every city across the Soviet Union. These Khrushchevki, as they were named for Nikita Khrushchev, who launched the project to construct them in the 1960s, and the slightly updated Brezhnevki, named for Leonid Brezhnev, and built in the 1970s, dot the skyline of every city in the former USSR, and millions of people still live in them today. When I first visited Moscow in 2011, I lived in one of these Khrushchevki, and it was actually nicer than one might think. Though they're not much to look at from the outside, on the inside, these apartments are usually pretty well cared for by their inhabitants. The Khrushchevka I lived in Moscow was significantly nicer than some of the places I've lived in New York City. The problem, however, was that all these buildings look the same, and when I first arrived, I didn't know the area. Back in 2011, I didn't have a smartphone, just a little prepaid flip phone with no internet access. And to get around in those days, I had to actually remember where things were, or God forbid, ask directions, and then actually listen carefully as someone explained how to get somewhere. Khrushchevki all look the same, and they all have the same benches in front of the door, the same little playground in front, and the same gopniks standing around drinking vodka and smoking cigarettes in that playground. One block looks very much like the next. So it was that on my second day in the city, I got lost. I walked up and down rows of Khrushchevki, not knowing which one was mine. Eventually, I decided to try to enter one that I thought looked familiar, and lo and behold, my key fob opened the outer door. I walked up the identical stairs to an identical door and thought I was home, but I was in the wrong building. I did eventually find my way home that evening, and eventually got the lay of the land. Some of those cigarette-smoking gopniks in front of my building would become my friends, and I have very warm memories of my time living in a Khrushchevka. There is actually a classic Soviet film whose plot boldly for the time satirizes the uniformity of these apartment buildings. I won't go down a rabbit hole and explain the plot of a 50-year-old Soviet movie to you, but if anyone's interested in a classic piece of Soviet cinema and a window into the Brezhnev-era Soviet Union, I highly recommend you check out The Irony of Fate or Enjoy Your Bath. The full movie's available on YouTube with English subtitles. for anyone who's interested. Another thing that can be remarkably confusing in Russia are all the similar street names. Inevitably, every Russian city will have a Pushkin Square, named for the famed 19th century Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, and they will have multiple streets and squares named for Yuri Gagarin. Moscow has, simultaneously, a Ploshad Gagarina, Gagarin Square, a Gagarinskaya Ulitsa, Gagarin Street, a Gagarinsky Prospekt, Gagarin Boulevard, and a Gagarinsky Pereulok, Gagarin Lane. Most other Russian cities also have at least one street, square, or park named Gagarin. It's a little like in the US, every city will inevitably have a Washington Boulevard or a Lincoln Park. When a figure becomes so important to a country that their legend is baked into the very identity of the nation, it's not uncommon to see multiple things named after them across multiple cities. It just so happens that in Russia, one of these legendary figures is Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet cosmonaut who was the first human being to travel to outer space and orbit the Earth. The legacy and achievements of the Soviet space program remain to this day a source of national pride among Russians, and not without justification. Growing up in America and studying the quote-unquote space race as the rivalry between the Soviet and American space programs came to be known, the framing of this race was that America quote-unquote won the space race when we became the first nation to successfully land men on the moon in 1969. Like the Second World War, in Russia and in America, the common understanding of the space race is painted by a skewed, patriotic version of events that highlights the successes and victories of one's own country while ignoring or marginalizing the achievements and victories of the other. So while Americans will often act as though the entire space race was just a race to walk men on the moon, Russians will often act like the Soviets weren't even really interested in going to the moon, and highlight the things that they did first as the greater achievements. It is true, a lot of the achievements of the space race, especially early on, were achieved first by the Soviets. While the Americans were the first to land men on the moon and to probe other planets, the Soviets were the first to launch an artificial satellite, the first to send animals into orbit, the first to send a man into space, the first to send an unmanned probe to the moon, the first to execute a successful spacewalk, and the first to construct a space station in Earth's orbit. The first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, was also from the Soviet Union. While ultimately, the space race is, in my opinion, one of the more fun and least depressing episodes of the Cold War, it does have its darker moments as well. And while it became an avenue for friendly scientific competition and even peaceful cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the saga of human space travel, like many of our greatest scientific advancements as a species, has its origin in mankind's seemingly endless desire to kill one another. Back in episode 11, I talked about the development of nuclear weapons. If you listened to that episode, you may recall that the American nuclear monopoly, which was so unacceptable to the Soviets, ended in 1949, when the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb. What resulted was a nuclear arms race between these two increasingly antagonistic superpowers. The destructive power of nuclear weapons was dramatically increased a few years later, when the United States created the first thermonuclear hydrogen bomb in 1952, and the Soviets followed suit just 1 year later in 1953. Throughout the first half of the 1950s, however, despite their rapid pace in catching up to the Americans in the development of nuclear weapons, the Soviets still found themselves at a strategic disadvantage when it came to the hypothetical deployment of these weapons. The primary delivery system for nuclear weapons at the time was still long-range bomber aircraft. The Americans not only had an edge in the quantity and quality of such long-range aircraft, but they also possessed air bases in East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, essentially surrounding the Soviet Union, such that in the event of nuclear war, the Americans would be able to fly over and drop nuclear bombs on the Soviet Union with relative ease. The Soviets could threaten American allies in Europe and Asia, but at this point they had no realistic means of directly threatening the United States with a nuclear strike. This lack of parity alarmed Stalin and Soviet military planners, and they frantically sought solutions to level the playing field. One area where recent scientific breakthroughs made during the war looked particularly promising to the Soviets was the realm of rocket science. In particular, toward the end of the war, German scientists developed and deployed the V-2 rocket, the world's first relatively accurate long-range ballistic missile. Developed by the future father of the American space program, Wernher von Braun, Hitler saw the V-2 as the miracle weapon that would save Germany from defeat. If it had been developed a few years earlier, the V-2 may have made a decisive impact on the war. However, by the time it was developed and put to use on the battlefield, the Allies were already advancing on all fronts, and Germany's defeat had become inevitable. The Soviets especially, but the Western Allies as well, looked at the V-2 rocket and understood that though it was too late to affect the outcome of World War II, this ballistic missile technology would likely be decisive in the next war. As they moved into Germany and became occupiers, the Soviets and the Americans scrambled to round up German scientists who had been involved in the V-2 program. In the hysteria of the arms race, the collaboration of these scientists with the murderous Nazi regime was largely forgotten, or at least cast aside, in favor of their scientific utility. There's a prevalent historical myth that while the scientists who came to America all did so willingly, those who worked with the Soviets only did so under threat, and this is of course not true. The Soviets did sometimes force scientists against their will to work in the ballistic missile program, but this was a last resort, and they usually preferred the carrot to the stick. Those German scientists who worked with the Soviets were usually given a variety of economic and other incentives to work with the Soviet Union. The Americans and the Soviets both wanted von Braun, and the Americans got him. He was a big get, but not, in my opinion, as decisive as some people think. There were plenty of scientists who had worked with him on the V-2 that ended up in the Soviet service, as well as homegrown Soviet rocket scientists of equal brilliance that more than made up for his absence. I'm also, on a more personal note, and this is my opinion, so take it for what it's worth, not a fan of von Braun for moral reasons. I'm usually inclined to be understanding and forgiving of those who make their peace with totalitarian regimes to survive. Having never lived in such a society and having never been faced with those kinds of difficult choices, I cannot know for sure how I would act, and I generally think it's unfair to judge people for difficult choices they make in life and death situations. Von Braun, however, made choices to join the Nazi Party. He was even a member of the SS. Not for survival, but for self-serving career advancement. The choice he faced was not life or death, but rather whether he would be able to continue his research. He chose to join the Nazis and continue his research to support their regime, willfully aiding one of the most murderous regimes in history. I do judge that. Over 20,000 concentration camp victims died assembling parts for the V-2 rocket program. And while he may not have had full knowledge of the numbers involved, von Braun was definitely aware that his program utilized forced labor from concentration camp inmates. I also judge the behavior of my own country in elevating him and sweeping his Nazi past under the rug because he was useful to us in our Cold War arms race. I don't think that was America's finest moment. Wernher von Braun was undoubtedly a brilliant scientist, and he did a lot to drive forward the advancement of rocket technology and space exploration. But as is often the case, this great man was not necessarily a good man. Von Braun's counterpart in the Soviet Union and their most brilliant rocket scientist was not a German scientist at all, but a Soviet of mixed Russian and Ukrainian heritage, Sergei Korolyov. Born in 1907 in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, to a Russian-Ukrainian father and a Ukrainian mother, Korolyov had a tumultuous family life as a child. His mother, Maria, and father, Pavel, split when he was very young, and though his father made many attempts to contact him, they were blocked by his mother, who told the young Sergei that his father was dead. Pavel would die for real in 1929 before Sergei learned the truth, and he never knew his father. His mother was also absent for much of his childhood, leaving him with her parents while she left to continue her education in Kyiv. Perhaps as a result of this tumultuous family life, Korolyov was very shy and a socially awkward child. He had trouble making friends and was generally a bit of a loner. He loved to read and was particularly interested in math and science. After witnessing an air show in Odessa in 1913, he became obsessed with airplanes and flying. Beginning in 1924, he studied aviation engineering at the Kyiv Polytechnic Institute. 2 years later, he was accepted and transferred into a much more prestigious program at Bauman Moscow State University, where he studied under and was mentored by the famed aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev. In 1931, he married his first wife, a former classmate from the Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, Ksenia Vincentini, with whom he had a daughter, Natalia. In the early 1930s, Korolyov worked with the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion, known by its Russian acronym GIRD, where he was part of a team that successfully launched both the first multi-phase rocket and the first liquid fuel-propelled rocket. Some of his colleagues from GIRD, including Mikhail Tikhonravov, would later go on to work with him on the Soviet space program. In 1933, the growing interest of the Soviet government in rocket technology for military purposes caused GIRD to be merged with the teams from other labs, becoming the Reactive Science Research Institute, and receiving a dramatic increase in funding. During this time, Korolyov oversaw the design and construction of cruise missiles and also drew up theoretical designs for rocket-propelled aircraft. Then, in 1938, things took a turn for Korolyov, as he was caught up in the Great Purge. Denounced by his colleagues, he confessed under torture to being part of an anti-Soviet, enemy Trotskyist organization that had infiltrated the Soviet scientific establishment for the purpose of sabotaging Soviet scientific progress. He spent most of the next year in a series of prisons and labor camps, eventually ending up as a slave laborer at a gold mine in the Kolyma region of the Russian Far East, near the Bering Strait. During his incarceration, Korolyov wrote numerous letters appealing his conviction, including to Stalin himself. When, in 1939, NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov was arrested and executed, and his replacement, Lavrenti Beria, decided to reopen and examine many of the cases Yezhov had pursued, Korolyov's was one of them. He was granted a new trial and ordered to return to Moscow for his new trial late in 1939. By the time word reached the labor camp of his new trial, it was already too late for him to travel to Moscow that year, as the only way out was by boat, and the ports had frozen for the season. He was forced to ride out the winter and wait for the spring thaw, only returning to Moscow the following year. By the time he managed to return to Moscow, Korolyov had lost most of his teeth from scurvy, and was in a sorry state. Following his second trial, his sentence was reduced to 8 years, and rather than a hard labor camp, he was sent to serve his sentence at a special prison for skilled scientists and engineers, where he served under the supervision of his former mentor, Andrei Tupolev, designing airplanes for the Red Air Force throughout World War II. He was officially released from custody by special government decree and allowed to visit his family in 1944, more than 6 years after his arrest. He and his wife tried to make things work for a little while, but he simply wasn't the same person he had been when he was arrested, and the couple eventually split up. His daughter, Natalia, who was only 3 when he was arrested, apparently blamed him for his own arrest, and was uninterested in getting to know him. The two would remain estranged for many years, only reconciling years later after Natalia had grown up and become an accomplished medical doctor. In 1945, Korolyov, still technically considered a convicted enemy of the people, was nonetheless commissioned as a colonel in the Red Army and sent to Germany, in charge of a research mission to reverse engineer and replicate the German V-2 rocket. The following year, concerned with the disadvantage in air power and long-range bombers versus the Americans that I mentioned before, Stalin officially made the development of long-range ballistic missiles the top priority of the Soviet military, and Korolyov was appointed to head the program, under the direct supervision of Dmitry Ustinov, the Minister for the Defense Industry. From the beginning, Korolyov had ideas for a more advanced rocket with a longer range, but his plans were overruled by Stalin, who insisted that Korolyov and his team focus their energy on reverse engineering the V-2, which they did successfully by late 1947. This Soviet version of the V-2 was dubbed the R-1. After the success of the R-1, Korolev finally obtained permission from Stalin to pursue his improved design, which was dubbed the R-2. The R-2 effectively doubled the range of the R-1. Then, an improved version of the R-2, very creatively dubbed the R-3, had an effective range of 3,000 kilometers, that's roughly 1,900 miles, and it brought the United Kingdom within striking distance from Soviet territory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, von Braun and his team of rocket scientists in the United States weren't exactly resting on their laurels, and they were making major advancements in missile technology, but they lacked the concentrated support and especially the unrestricted funding that Korolev and his team were given by the Soviets. Given that the Americans had the advantage in air power and a larger overall stockpile of nuclear weapons, US military leadership simply didn't see ballistic missile research and development as a top priority, and its funding took a back seat to more conventional weapons delivery systems like the famous B-52 long-range bomber aircraft. This changed in 1953 when Soviet nuclear scientists successfully tested their first thermonuclear hydrogen bomb, a new form of nuclear weapon first tested by the Americans a year earlier with a destructive capacity nearly 1,000 times that of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The thought of the Soviets targeting the United States or its allies with this kind of weapons by means of a long-range missile terrified the American public and spurred America's military and scientific establishment into action. At last, the American rocket scientists had all the funding they needed. America's program, however, was still stymied by its lack of centralization. Rather than a single ballistic missile project, the United States had several, one from each branch of the military, competing with each other for funding and resources. Von Braun, Korolev, and scientists in both countries realized the potential of this missile technology to facilitate the exploration of space. Indeed, much of the theoretical knowledge that was applied in designing these various rockets relied on the theories and publications of an earlier Russian scientist, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who had died in 1935. Tsiolkovsky was the first to theorize the design for a multi-stage rocket, the same kind of technology utilized in building long-range ballistic missiles. Tsiolkovsky had dreamed up these rockets not as a weapon, but as a means of launching spaceships. Von Braun and Korolev both shared Tsiolkovsky's dream, and were merely waiting for the right opportunity to convert the application of their work from designing missiles to designing spaceships. Von Braun continuously warned the Eisenhower administration that the Soviets were working on a space program, and that if they were allowed to launch satellites, those satellites could be used to easily spy on the United States from space. And he also warned of the potential for sighting nuclear targets by satellite imaging. To most in the early 1950s, such ideas seemed fantastical, but some intelligence reports from the CIA, recently declassified, show that the American intelligence community, at least, took this threat very seriously. Eventually, Eisenhower's intelligence advisors convinced him not only that the Soviets were working on launching an artificial satellite into space, but that if the Americans launched their own, it would be a useful intelligence gathering tool. To do so first, they advised, would not only be a massive propaganda victory over the Soviets, but would also allow the Americans, under the guise of open scientific research, to establish the precedent under international law that the orbital space over the entire globe, including the space over the Soviet Union, was freely accessible by all nations for peaceful scientific purposes. As an aside, this precedent was eventually set and is written into multiple later treaties on conduct in outer space. The Soviets, in fact, were not working on launching a satellite into orbit and had been ignoring and shrugging off Korolev's urging them to do so. But when, in 1955, Eisenhower publicly announced the United States' intention to launch an artificial satellite into orbit before the end of 1958, the game was on. I've talked at length in previous episodes about Nikita Khrushchev's foreign policy and the fact that he favored diplomacy and peaceful coexistence with the West. But importantly, this did not mean that he thought the Soviet Union should be more like the West, or that there should be no competition between the Soviets and the Western democracies. On the contrary, Khrushchev often spoke of the necessity and inevitability of a struggle between capitalism and communism. He just didn't think this struggle had to necessarily be an armed struggle. Rather, he saw it as a struggle of ideas, a war of propaganda and information rather than guns and missiles. He truly believed in the superiority of the Soviet socialist system over Western capitalism, and that this struggle could be won by demonstrating to the world the superiority of the socialist state. So, when following Eisenhower's announcement of the Americans' goal to launch a satellite, Korolev approached him and insisted that the Soviets had the capability to launch a satellite first and show up the Americans, Khrushchev was prepared to listen. Khrushchev gave Korolev permission to launch a satellite, quote, as long as it does not interfere with the main project, end quote. The main project still being the development of ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads to major US cities. The Soviets did have a distinct advantage in terms of this race, as the rockets they possessed at this time were considerably more powerful. This is because the Soviet design for their hydrogen bomb was significantly heavier than the American version, and thus, Korolev and his team had been forced to innovate in their design, designing a rocket that could carry a 5-ton warhead halfway around the world. Korolev already had a design for the rocket he needed by 1956, and the only thing left to do was to build and test it, the famed R-7. Though the first 3 tests of the R-7 failed, with the rocket either failing to launch or exploding or crashing shortly after liftoff, Korolev was undeterred, and after making minor alterations, the R-7 was successfully tested on August 21, 1957. Launching a dummy warhead into the atmosphere with it re-entering and hitting its target in the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia's Far East, some 3,700 miles, that's roughly 6,000 kilometers from its launch point in Kazakhstan. It was the world's first successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, and it meant the Soviet Union now had the ability to strike directly at American cities with its most deadly weapons. Then, on October 4th, 1957, Korolev completed his secondary project, using a modified version of the R-7 to launch Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, into Earth's orbit. The satellite was a relatively simple design and not particularly sophisticated by the standards of today's technology, but it was a revolutionary moment in the history of mankind. A metal sphere about the size of a beach ball with 4 antennae protruding from it, Sputnik 1 was designed for its flight path to be visible at one point or another from everywhere on Earth, and it omitted a radio signal, easily picked up by amateur radios, of a steady beep, beep, beep. This was enough to cause a minor panic in the United States about the potential threat posed by Soviet satellites in space. President Eisenhower addressed the nation on November 13, 1957, and sought to assuage those fears, noting that the satellite itself was no threat at all, and was purely a scientific instrument, though he did note the urgency of the situation and the need for America to catch up to the scientific advances of the Soviet Union, saying, quote, "We have long had evidence, recently very dramatic evidence, that even under such a system, it is possible to produce some remarkable material achievements. When such competence in things material is at the service of leaders who have so little regard for things human, and who command the power of an empire, there is danger ahead for free men everywhere." That, my friends, is the reason why the American people have been so aroused by the Earth satellites. Of course, free men are meeting and will meet this challenge. Up to a point, this must be done on the communists' own terms, outmatching them in military power, general technological advance, and specialized education and research. End quote. The United States further responded by enacting the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA, and consolidating the various competing space projects under a single agency. And just like that, the space race was on. Though the creation of NASA improved the haphazard and disorganized American space program, the Soviets were still off to a head start, and they followed up the launch of Sputnik 1 with a series of one-ups, each more groundbreaking than the last. Less than a month after the launch of Sputnik 1, on November 3, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, which, for me, as a dog lover, is one of the more upsetting chapters of the space race, but nonetheless a groundbreaking milestone. The second Sputnik was launched with a dog on board, a stray Samoyed terrier mix from Moscow named Laika. Laika had sensors surgically attached to her that would monitor her heart rate, perspiration, and blood pressure. The object of the mission was to monitor how a living animal similar to a human would fare in orbit. The craft was not designed to land safely, and Laika was never expected to survive. There's been debate over the years as to Laika's exact cause of death. Then, in 2002, a scientist who was involved in the top secret project revealed that the consensus among the team was that she overheated and died on her fourth orbit around the Earth, just a few hours into the voyage. Debates still rage over whether this experiment was ethical, and I don't think it was. Laika was sent into space on an accelerated timeline, and several of the scientists who worked on the project later indicated that if they'd been given more time, they could have properly designed the capsule to give her a chance to survive the voyage. But the higher-ups had decided that beating the Americans was more important than Laika's life. Though she did not return alive, Laika still has the distinction of being the first known living organism to travel in outer space and orbit the Earth. Sputnik 2 was followed up with Sputnik 3, which sent several measuring instruments into space that sent even more data to the ground crew about conditions of life in orbit. By May 1960, Korolev and his team were ready to test a new, improved capsule that was designed to launch living organisms into orbit and return them safely to Earth. The first of these capsules, that would come to be known as the Vostok craft, was successfully tested on May 15, 1960, without passengers. Then, on August 19, 1960, the craft was tested with living animals on board. 2 more dogs, also Moscow strays, named Bielka, which is Russian for squirrel or alternatively little whitey, and Strelka, which means little arrow, as well as a variety of mice and other small animals and various plants. The capsule was also equipped with a camera, which captured images of Bielka and Strelka during their famous voyage. After 25 hours and 4 circles around the Earth, the capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere, returning Bielka and Strelka safely. Both dogs were instant celebrities all over the world, but especially in the Soviet Union, where they were celebrated as heroes and even had their image posted on a Soviet postage stamp. As an interesting aside, Bielka was bred, and one of her puppies was later presented as a gift to U.S. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy by Nikita Khrushchev during a diplomatic visit to the United States in 1961. After the success of Bielka and Strelka's voyage, Korolev received approval from Khrushchev and the Central Committee to proceed with his plans for a manned mission to outer space. Even before Bielka and Strelka were launched into orbit, the man who would make the historic journey had already been chosen, 26-year-old Red Air Force pilot Yuri Gagarin. When a figure like Gagarin achieves the legendary status that he now holds, it can sometimes be difficult to sort out the facts of their early life from the legend created by their celebrity. We know that Gagarin was born in a small village in the Smolensk region of western Russia on March 9, 1934. Official Soviet biographies describe how, during the German occupation in World War II, young Gagarin was forced to work as a slave laborer for the occupiers, and was actually part of a covert resistance organization that sabotaged the German war effort. To my knowledge, this account has never been independently verified. It is all too common for Soviet heroes who lived through the Great Patriotic War to gain some legitimacy by claiming an important role in that war effort. And while Gagarin himself was actually a very humble man, the propagandists who wrote his official biographies were not so reserved. I personally find it unlikely that a boy between the ages of 6 and 8 played such an active role in the anti-fascist resistance, but it's also not so far-fetched as to be impossible. Plenty of children served in the ranks of the partisans, for instance, but usually not quite that young. It is true that as a boy, Yuri Gagarin witnessed the German occupation of his village firsthand, and that 2 of his older siblings were deported to Germany for forced labor. He very likely witnessed the horrible brutality of the Nazis during this time. In 1950, at the age of 16, while working as an apprentice in a foundry, Gagarin joined the local flying club in his spare time and was trained as a pilot. In 1955, he was accepted into an academy training fighter pilots for the Red Air Force in the city of Orenburg. Gagarin was famously very short, 1.57 meters, or approximately 5'2". And while training to fly warplanes, he reportedly failed his first attempt at landing because he was not tall enough to properly see out of the cockpit. But his commanding officer gave him another chance after providing him with a cushion to sit on for the exam. The cushion did the trick and he passed. He completed his training as a fighter pilot and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Red Air Force on November 5, 1957. In 1959, he was recommended by his commanding officer for service in the space program, and was one of 154 candidates from across the USSR to join the ranks of the first cosmonauts. Eventually, this was narrowed down to 20, who actually received the specialized training to travel into space. The rigorous training process eventually narrowed the pool down to 2 men, Yuri Gagarin and German Titov. Gagarin was selected as the primary pilot and Titov as his alternate. Both were trained for the mission, and Titov would follow on another mission shortly behind Gagarin, becoming the second man in space. On April 12, 1961, as Gagarin prepared for launch, over the radio, Korolev wished him luck and assured him that everything was going fine. As liftoff began, Gagarin replied, saying, "Поехали," Russian for "let's go." The word would become, and remains to this day, something of a catchphrase associated with Gagarin and the Russian space program. As Gagarin launched into the sky and proceeded to complete a single orbit around the Earth in zero gravity, he left the old world behind. The world he returned to had not changed dramatically, save in one respect. Mankind had now officially entered the space age, and our understanding of the universe would reach new horizons. I can't help but think of the words of that early Russian scientist who pioneered the theory of spaceflight that Gagarin put into practice, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky famously said, quote, "Earth is the cradle of mankind, but one cannot forever live in a cradle." End quote. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and you want to support the show, I encourage you to support us with a monthly donation on Spotify or Patreon. I don't do this for money, but the support I do get really helps me to continue doing it. Links to Patreon, Spotify, and all our social media pages can be found on our website at www.thehistorysphere.com. If you can't afford to donate right now, that's okay. You can also help out by giving a 5-star rating on the podcast platform you're listening on, and by following and engaging with us on social media. Every bit of engagement we get helps to promote the show and spread the word. The most common way people learn about new podcasts is word of mouth, so you can also support us by telling your friends. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will cover what many consider to be the high watermark of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.